If you've ever been to a Christian wedding ceremony or two, it is very likely that you are very familiar with the passage from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians that we are about to hear. Even if you haven't attended a wedding in a long while, you'll likely recognize it. This is perhaps the most widely recognized and quoted passage anywhere in the letters of Paul. The text is often used at weddings because it appears to praise the value of romantic human love. But what is often missed, and perhaps what is even sometimes downright ignored, is the fact that this text was first written not to partners or spouses or really any individual few at all, but rather to a community that was having a very difficult time staying together. It is the difficult realities of relationships and communities, not romantic or familial love, that Paul has in mind. As far as scholars can tell, Paul founded the church in Corinth around the year 51 CE, and this letter was written about 3 years later from Ephesus, after Paul had been away from Corinth for some time. Between that founding of the church and the time of this letter, it seems that the people in Corinth were misunderstanding Paul's instructions and experiencing some divisions in the church. When things began to look especially bleak and complicated, 3 men brought Paul a letter from the church, and in response to that, Paul writes. He responds to the disputes and disorders within the congregation, giving instructions about the apparent jockeying of rival groups for control and addressing the marginalization of the congregation's disadvantaged members. And in this part of the letter, Paul encourages everyone to act in love. Of course, Paul never says that such love will feel good, and this is where the typical use of this chapter falls short. While love may be patient and kind, it certainly isn't perfect, and it becomes more complicated when we're asked not just to love someone that we're choosing, but a whole community and a whole world of people who look and smell and think and talk and act differently than we do. For Paul, true love is not measured by how good it makes us feel. Rather, in the context of 1 Corinthians at least, it would be better to say that the measure of love is the capacity of us to know that we are different, racially, geographically, politically, denominationally, and to hold those differences in tension without dividing ourselves.
If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but I do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, so as to remove mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these 3, and the greatest of these is love. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Amen.
Two days from now, on Tuesday, I will embark on a familiar drive. I will leave work at noontime and drive south on I-355. Kept company by NPR or one of my husband's Springsteen albums, I'll take 88 East next and then I-290. And when I near the loop, as traffic really heightens, I'll take the US 41 South exit toward Lakeshore Drive, and I'll wind along the lakefront, falling into pace with the other cars that go at least 30 miles over the speed limit, until I reach the Museum of Science and Industry, where I'll hang a right at 57th and weave my way back from the shoreline until I see the comfortable building of Chicago Theological Seminary at the corner of 60th and Dorchester, just across the street from the Midway Plaisance. I'll pull my car off the road, park, gather my books, lock my car, lift on my heavy pack, and begin the final semester of my seminary career. Now, if you've never visited the seminary, and if you keep your eyes and ears more attuned to suburban news than the goings-on in the city, you may not know that Chicago Theological Seminary has actually only been at the corner of 60th and Dorchester for about 4 years. I would like to describe that change for you while you wonder what it possibly has to do with Paul. Before my time as a student, and for a very long time, the now more than 160-year-old seminary lived in the heart of what became the University of Chicago campus. It owned a few buildings over there, wrapping around the north side of 58, then the east side of University Avenue, nestled right into Hyde Park. But in 2008, the university announced plans to buy those old buildings from the seminary and to construct a new home for it just a few blocks away. When the news hit about this proposed sale and purchase of the old building, surrounding residents as well as landmark historians and architectural enthusiasts erupted. The seminary buildings were historical. They were part of the neighborhood and part of the makeup. They were designed by Herbert Riddle, who was not insignificant in architecture, and yeah, okay, maybe they were crumbling, but they were beautiful, darn it. And beauty must be preserved. Now, a few years later, since the sale and purchase and renovations are all complete, we see that it turned out University of Chicago actually did a pretty great job. The old buildings are still there, and the overtly religious pieces that the university didn't want for an economics building, stained glass and crosses and relics and remembrances from years past, were for the most part either incorporated into our new building or preserved off-site somewhere for study and display. What's fascinating to me, as someone who never actually weathered the change, I simply showed up after the move was already done, is how the seminary faculty and staff in particular recall this move. Sure, the old building was a beloved space. They knew that they would miss it and they were worried about how it would change, but the biggest concern for the seminary wasn't changing spaces, it was changing neighborhoods. See, in the move from one campus location to the other, CTS moved from Hyde Park to Woodlawn. And in the landscape of Chicago, changing neighborhoods is a fairly big deal. In this case, it's actually a really big deal when you consider the contrast between the two. Hyde Park is really beautiful. It's safe, it's kind of wealthy, it's got houses, and it's got a university and a presidential home, whereas Woodlawn is different. The median the median income for a house in Woodlawn is about $25,000. It's full of illegally subdivided housing. It's a food desert. And it has already had 41 violent crimes, 86 property crimes, and 52 quality of life crimes reported this year. Really, if you want to get a feel for the neighborhood without stopping by, you might revisit Lorraine Hansberry's classic, A Raisin in the Sun. As you might recall, that play tells the story of her family living in Woodlawn. While I personally have never felt really unsafe on our campus, the heads-up students' crime reports that come out weekly keep me on my toes. And I have been caught by surprise a few times, like when I stayed with a friend for a week and was informed that his apartment housed the only white people in the high-rise. Or when I walked out of the library late one night to find that I had a flat tire and heard my roadside assistance guy first tell me emphatically to please go wait inside, and then insist on escorting me to the nearest filling station when my spare tire needed a shot of air. Perhaps these moments carry the same cautious sentiment that leaves some faculty of our seminary to quietly encourage students to take our study breaks north of campus rather than heading south. And it's certainly the reason that with our building just on the edge of Woodlawn, there seems to be an unspoken agreement to just pretend that we're still in Hyde Park. Now, while it may seem odd to consider that a seminary should ever try to choose a side between neighborhoods, let me remind you of the church in Corinth and our words from Paul. I told you we'd get back to him. It turns out that even in our own faith communities, even in our seminaries and our churches, but even amongst family, the unfamiliar, and friends, we are no strangers to division or drawing lines. The whole world, as it turns out, is divided. Racially, geographically, politically, tactically, denominationally, we are in the practice of taking and holding sides. Now, when we look at today's readings from 1 Corinthians, it's clear that the divisions in Corinth were a little bit different than those that I'm seeing at my seminary in Chicago. This wasn't some neighborhood dispute. The problem Paul seems to have with the Corinthian church is not that they're ranking geographical locations, but rather it seems to be the ways that they are ranking people. Some in the community appear to have claimed special religious knowledge, superior spiritual gifts. There is an implication that the community is torn over who has the real gospel, the real point, who's really reigning with Christ. Speaking in tongues and prophetic powers are getting in the way of the community, and in an odd twist, even the giving away of possessions is lifted up as problematic. Which leads me to believe that Paul was not upset with these spiritual, likely well-intentioned moves in and of themselves. Rather, he was upset that apparent gifts and seemingly kind acts were creating division. And no matter the subject, the divisions we create amongst ourselves are always the same. Whether we argue over gifts or geography, policy or politics, when we choose sides and proclaim we'll only be loyal to one, we typically get the same result. In our attempts to justify our own stances and decisions and positions, we shut others out. And in the process of drawing lines and choosing sides, we limit our love to a few. But without love, Paul tells us, power and ability, wealth and generosity, they all mean nothing. For a seminary or a church's purpose, we might say that without love, worship and engagement and wisdom are worthless too. Without love, none of it matters. Not buildings, not budgets, not leaders, not missional strategies. No doctrine or activism or spirituality stands a chance, no matter what amazing things we do, if we do them without remembering first that we are called to practice love. Paul says, who cares? If that sounds rough enough already, brace yourselves, because it's going to get rougher. While many read this passage and hope that Paul is just talking about some idealized love, some godly love that human beings can achieve but from which we can draw hope, I've got to tell you, I don't think that that's the case here. If anything was real for Paul, if anything was true, it was that the good news of the gospel proclaimed this love possible. And if Christ came for nothing else, Paul might say, this, creating room for this kind of love, this is what Christ came to do. And so the only side we can choose is that of the gospel, which tells us to choose regard over rejection, respect over reduction, interest over ignoring, love over hate, peace over conflict, each other over ourselves, again and again and again. It must have been late last spring or maybe early last summer. Whenever it was, the day finally came that I decided to break the seminary community's unspoken recommendation that I keep to the sidewalks going north, and I began a walk with no particular purpose, heading south. I wasn't really looking for anything. I only knew that I hadn't seen much in that direction beyond the campus parking lot, and that seemed to me like a shame. So I strolled, and I observed, and I wondered how far I might go, and a few blocks away I stumbled upon a large garden that seemed out of place and caught me rather by surprise. I stood for a few minutes peering over the fence that surrounded it before spotting a woman whose name I no longer remember, who I waved to, asking if I might be let in. She obliged, and once inside, as I looked around at the picnic table and the fire pit and the sandbox and all of the plots, I asked her, somewhat baffled, "What is this place?" "It's a co-op," she said. "Started a few years ago, so that we could have fresh food around here when there used to be none." Now, I mentioned it before, but it bears repeating. The Woodlawn neighborhood is a food desert, which means that it's a genuine hardship for members of that community to get to a grocery store. It can be a number of miles between a resident's home and the nearest place to purchase fresh produce, and if you don't have a car, which is the case for many, that means either walking or taking a ride on the CTA, and if carrying groceries on public transit sounds like a pain, it's probably because it is. This kind of inconvenience and hardship means that a lot of the women and men and their children who live in Woodlawn opt out and stop at a fast food place or a convenience store to get their food instead. And even if they were to find a banana on the shelves of the corner store, it would probably cost 70 cents, or at a grocery store, it would only cost 25. Over the course of my visit to that garden, as I asked more questions, the woman gave me a tour of the contained, lush space, explaining about the 100 families or so that rent space to grow fresh food in these 10 by 10-foot plots. And as she guided our path along the fence line at one side, we slowed so that she could point to a long row of fresh-looking soil just outside. "This," she said, "is the best part. You noticed there was a lock on the fence, right?" I nodded. There had been a padlock at the entrance. It's why I had to wave her down in the first place to get in. "See," she said, "people used to break in and steal our vegetables. People who don't have plots. And we were going to build a bigger fence, but instead we all got together and we decided to share our seeds. Started planting vegetables outside the fence, too. Haven't had a single break-in since, at least not that I know of. Nobody steals anymore. Instead, they come by, they pick their own stuff, and they smile." I nodded, smiling myself, and told her, "Gosh, that was a great idea." "Yeah," she said. There's no fence that can stop two kinds of people. One that's determined to do something hateful, like steal, and the other that's determined to do something loving, like give. This garden is on the loving side, and I'm trying to be too. I'm trying to be too. Now, there is an honesty that all of us, even Paul, can understand, about how easy it should be to make the rather obvious choice to be on the side of love, and about how often we still manage to divide ourselves up and tend our own plots, forgetting our neighbors and ignoring our connections instead. I've gone back to that garden a few times since my first visit, sometimes with a book in hand, but usually with just a spare hour or so. And as I sit in the garden in the neighborhood that I hid from for so long and that I still hide from, if I'm honest, in that neighborhood that the adjacent communities and even nearby campuses still aren't sure how to love, I do my best to listen to the voices of the people as they plant and sow. I listen to their stories and their chatter. Sometimes I'll hear a kid nearby humming a familiar tune, and I listen and look, and when I remember how I have been welcomed in, I offer to help, usually scolding myself for sitting so long before offering, asking myself what I was waiting for. In those moments, I try to remember that in the end, neither Paul or Christ is really waiting for any of us to decide when we're going to love or who is or who isn't within the scope of love. That's already been determined. The gospel proclaims love for all of us, and it proclaims this love whether we know it or like it or accept it or choose it or feel it or not. So much of what we have is like the stuff of that garden. It's beautiful and it fills our lives, but it has only a season, and then it will wither and it will go. Paul writes that our prophecies will end, our tongues will cease, our knowledge will not last. Even faith and hope will change when faith gives way to clearer sight and our hopes in the gospel become fulfilled. But the greatest of these, love, Paul promises will remain. It will not waver, it will not wither, it will not falter or fail or fall, even when we do. The true message of the gospel, as Paul proclaimed it, is that this great love is not only possible, but is already in our midst. It's not breaking forth, it has broken, and love is how we will transform this world. God has already given us all that we need to get started. We just need to walk outside and take a good look around. When you look around, what are your fences? When you look around, what are your walls? What are the streets you've been told or decided for yourself not to cross? Who and what are you keeping out? Who and what are you trapping inside? We don't have to tear down every boundary tomorrow. We don't have to remove them all at once, but what would happen if we opened that padlock gate just a little? What if we started planting just a few seeds outside? What if we prepared the soil and began the planting? What might God make grow? On this last day of January, let us remember that spring is coming. It's coming. And I, for one, can't wait to see what God's love and our love have in store.